Hey, what's going on YouTube and the Gospel Gambit chess school community? My name's Kevin, aka Gospel Gambit, and bringing you guys round 5 of the Delray Open that I played in the under 1800 section. The last two games, which were on day 3, started with round 5 and round 6. At the time, I pretty much needed 2 wins to at least be top or jump up into the top 3. At the time of the tournament, I was 1528, as you can see on the screen. Spoiler, I did end up getting about 50 rating points. I'm at 1570 something, 75, I believe, after the update came out. So, kind of a peek ahead of what these next two games kind of look like. Today, we jump into a white game. I ended up getting white both games on day 3. The half point buy that I took in round 3 kind of shook up how my games are going. So we had black first, then white, black, and then white. So I was expecting white in this game. I didn't know what to expect in game 6. But we'll get to that game in the next YouTube video. So today we sat down against someone that was equal in our rating range. So at the time of the tournament, he was 1560. And at this point, we were kind of moving up the boards, as in we were getting closer and closer towards the top boards of the tournament. Of course, we dove right into e4, and when my opponent played d5, after retake, obviously I was hoping for Leonhard Gambit, and what my opponent played was not that, so we did not end up going into the Scandinavian Leonhard Gambit, which I've done multiple videos on here on the channel, as well as an opening guide for. But we did dive into a knight f6 version of the Scandinavian, and I just know from losing to this sort of variation in the past that if you're not careful with how you set up your pieces for white, or if you try to get too fancy with things, that problems can occur if you try to get greedy out of the opening. It's probably one of my least favorite openings to play against from the Scandi side of things. And again, just kind of like the game 2 video where we played against the modern, this knight f6 variation of the Scandinavian is not my most booked up variation that I know or that I've studied. Going back into the database slash YouTube videos, I looked to see what Grandmaster Narditsky has suggested to this move from some of his speedrun videos, and he suggests a very interesting line that he said his teacher when he was younger mentioned to him. Obviously, this bishop most of the time wants to kind of pin our knight here, and that happens in a lot of Scandi lines. He offers this line where we play bishop to b5. Black ends up defending, obviously, because he wants us to trade and possibly develop a second piece. Obviously, if we trade our bishop for his bishop and his knight gets to come out, well, black's already starting to get a big tempo slash lead in development from the minority piece play. So in this position, what we do is we bring our bishop all the way back to e2, so it's still developed. We're kind of claiming that white has put their bishop in a very awkward spot. If they want to waste time and move their bishop out again, then we can simply bring our knight out to f3, castle, and get underway with our development. If you look at the database, actually, after this move, the bishop e2 scores the highest in the Lichess database, with scoring 53% of the time versus 41% for black. And it pretty much looks like the best continuation with a high number of games played at the very least. So after like bishop to e2, black's kind of in an awkward position. Obviously, they could push one of these pawns. This knight now really doesn't want to develop over to a6. Its only other development squares kind of blocked here on d7. If black decides to push a pawn, well, then maybe we can trade off this really weak d5 pawn that we were already expecting to lose anyways for a second pawn from black's camp. So this line I'm going to kind of remember in the future, and it kind of goes like this. If black takes the pawn, we play d4, and we continue on with our development scheme. So a good just short little line to remember if you do end up facing this knight f6 variation yourself. Funny enough, I faced this again in the Wednesday right after the tournament. Had not looked at that variation just yet and ended up losing a game versus an 1800 level player, 1850 USCF player in just a Wednesday night classical match. So in the game, I ended up playing d4. This is what I normally play online. And my opponent ends up going for this move, c6. Obviously, as a gambit player myself, I was a bit dubious of this move. According to the engine, we can take the pawn, and we're considered up about a +8 advantage. During the time of the game, though, like I said, I was already not the most booked up on the knight f6 Scandinavian, so I was very cautious about taking this pawn here on c6. I mean, if we take, I just felt from the perspective of playing like the Smith-Morra and knowing that black is all of a sudden has major piece play already right out of the opening, and we're already starting to lag behind in development. So I was very dubious. I just wanted to play something solid. Black again is kind of taking away another square for this knight. If they take, well, we're going to have sort of opposite, almost like I don't even know what you'd call that, like an exchange of some sort of almost like Karl Khan / Slav exchange in that sense. So I was kind of happy just to go into a middle game with both of us having pawns here on d4, d5. So I just wanted to continue my development. I played knight f3, thinking that my opponent was going to take back with the pawn. Again, develop his knight out to c6, play e6, normal development moves, bishop to g4 possibly before e6. But just wanted to head into the middle game without being blown off the board. And again, like I said, I didn't want to be blown off the board by the quick development by black's pieces. Black ends up going for this pin here on g4. And again, I just wanted to play kind of simple chess out of the opening. It's kind of a good tip at these over-the-board tournaments. I feel like people are very hesitant to take the gambit. So like for the Smith-Morra, people are kind of hesitant to take again on c3. That one might be a bad example, as most people think that they can take on c3, and if even without knowing too much theory. But when I play like the Evans Gambit and some of these other gambits, people are way more hesitant to take the pawn on b4. And I believe if I ever played against a Leonhardt Gambit over the board, I would also get some hesitancy from my opponents for taking the pawn on b4 as well. So if you don't know the theory going into a gambit line, you can decline. Sometimes declining is bad, though, is if that move allows your opponent to get an advantage, even if you don't take on it. So at this point, again, just playing simply, I played h3. Again, you can kind of keep track of the evaluation at the top here. Yes, it is a quote-unquote mistake by the computer, but we still hold a slight advantage coming out of the early game. And at this point, with my pawn still being on c2, I thought if black decides to do this, the classic bishop maneuver of h5, g6, possibly I would just go for some sort of try to win the bishop pair, first of all, and then maybe castle queenside. Like I said, I was trying to play for wins on day 3 here. There was money involved in the top 3 of the tournament. There's money involved with being the top under 1600 player in the 1800 section. So this first game of the day, I was trying to play for a win, and some of the moves later on I'll kind of point out were me trying to keep some winning chances alive. My opponent did end up trading, and he ended up taking with the queen, which was very surprising to me. Again, I was a little bit frustrated at this move because it kind of forces the issue a bit. Our pawn on d4 is undefended. If I go to defend the pawn with one of these moves, then black can take on f3 and ruin my pawn structure here on the king side. And let's say I just play, let's say, knight to c3. Well, that just drops the pawn might have been an option to play knight to c3 and then go a pawn down and try to, again, either castle queenside, kingside, and play with these open and half open files down the middle. But I ended up taking the queen, which I believe is the top computer move. So it's yeah, take second move, queen to b3. Obviously b7. So a couple different options, but I did end up going with the take options here. Black again takes with the piece I didn't think they were going to take. So by taking this way, all of a sudden this knight again is restricted from taking a leap out to c6. Again, the computer wanted to kind of take that way. I was kind of expecting something like this, you know, and then maybe we'd get a position, bring my knight over, bring my bishop out. Fairly even, but at least we have the bishop pair, and we can try to play for some chances in the late game. Instead, my opponent takes with the knight, and here there's a few different options. c4 is an option. Just continuing our development with one of these bishops. But something I do have to be careful of is this weak pawn on c2, because black is threatening possibly to jump into b4 and then take with double attack. And even if I can get castled in 2 moves, if black takes, obviously my rook is trapped here on a1, so I could still lose the rook if I'm not too careful. I think one of the simpler approaches would be to play the move such as c3. Obviously it takes away that square, reinforces the middle, and builds a nice little pawn chain here. Again though, I was trying to look for ways to keep the game imbalanced. I wanted options to be able to possibly castle queenside, and I wanted to play for a win. So I kind of played this, started off with bishop to d2, defending the square on b4, keeping my pawn here safe on c2, and giving me this triple pawn structure shell in case I do end up going queenside with my castles. And it's kind of a waiting move to see how black wants to play. Black goes for g6, which I was not expecting. Out of all the moves, I thought the most common move would be e6, you know, putting pawns on light squares, allowing his dark square bishop to roam free. Or even knight to d7 to f6. You know, even e6 into c5, where he can attack my center a little bit and put some pressure here on the center. So g6 was already a interesting move. Again, it wasn't in any of my calculations when I first was thinking about this position. And I did use a fair amount of time, I would say, in the early game after we went for this sort of queen trade variation, and to try to think of ways to keep chances alive on the board. So I went for a big think here and came up with this move, knight to a3, which is not, well, it's the second best move according to the engine. Third best, you know, within the top 3, let's say. My idea is that with knight to a3, we can castle kingside or queenside right away, and we can try to launch these pawns, bring our rooks into the game, and play an opposite castle game. I assumed, you know, black was going to be going bishop to g7, castling short, and we could kind of just see where the chips fall. I have this move to get to c4 if need be, e3, or even dropping back down to d2 later on. If I am forced to go for this triple pawn setup here, I could always drop my knight into c2. And not too worried about this pawn setup if black, especially if they play bishop to g6 or g7, if I'm castled queenside, because once my king goes on to b1, well, black doesn't have a light squared bishop, so all these light squared weaknesses in my camp are not really a big deal. There's not going to be any bishop bishop attacks along the light square diagonal. Queens are already off the board as well, so there's not going to be any queen side attacks or queen attacks along the light square diagonal. And that's something that I've brought into both of these games on day 3. Both of these games were early queen trades, and they were minor piece with rooks heavy middle and end games. So I was not too worried about having a weakened light squares. And that's something that you should think about in your own games. What pieces have already come off the board? When you still have a queen and both bishops on the board, attacks can come very quickly and very devastating along certain colored squares on the board. And if you're able to take away that attacking power, then you're able to use those light squares or quote unquote give up light squared or dark squared weaknesses without being punished for them. So that's kind of a tip to take in your own games. Now, black here, I thought had a few different options. Obviously, they could continue on with their development, bishop to g7. I also thought, it's not in the top 3 moves, but I thought e6 was also another option. Again, it kind of weakens their own dark squares, but it hits this knight on a3. And as you can see, it does want black to start launching, h5 possibly, and possibly getting some more space over on the king side. Or knight to d7, just continue development. What my opponent ended up doing here was playing e5 with the idea of threatening to take on a3 and doubling my pawns on the a file, attacking my middle here. But after doing some thinking about it, I was okay already going into this sort of position where I had doubled pawns on the a file, especially because my opponent is giving me a pawn in the middle in which he believes that he's able to recapture. But as you're going to see, we're just going to be a pawn up heading into the middle game here. So we end up taking on e5. My opponent takes on a3. We go for this doubled pawn a-file structure, which we are, again, totally fine with. Our opponent has no bishops now, and we have the bishop pair versus knight pair, and 2 rooks for each of us. We all of a sudden have access to a b-file with ideas to chip away. Let's say if black plays moves like b6, b5, we have 2 pawns now that can easily be pushed up the board and try to attack certain squares on black's queenside position. So these pawns are actually useful even though they're doubled pawns. We still have this c4 move to kind of dislodge black's knight on d5. And we have a very dynamic game ahead of us. And that was my entire goal going into the middle game, especially trying to play for a win. Try to keep the game dynamic and not being so afraid of being checkmated. Again, especially with queens off the board, you have some extra time, more than likely, to play a bit slower and keep your king in the middle, as both of us had. My opponent decided to play this move knight to d7, attacking our pawn on e4. And at this point, we have this great move, f4, reinforcing our structure in the middle here. Our dark squared bishop's doing a great job of playing defense against this knight on d5. All of a sudden, this knight looks a little awkward. Doesn't have the f6 square. It has a couple squares over on the queen side that it can take advantage of. But all of a sudden, like black's pawn push on g6 maybe is a little awkward as well, as the pawn on g7's there now, not to reinforce. Let's say black was able to blockade this pawn on d5. Well, if they have pawns here, maybe he can push f6, start chipping away at my center. At this point, black castles long. It makes sense. Bring a rook to the middle. But by going long, I also thought, I am going to have counterplay against this king. I believe he could have gone long, or how about it's going short here? It's about the same. So long or short, maybe I get a little bit bigger advantage for going if he goes short, and I could castle long myself. But either way, my opponent goes long. And at this point, I was kind of content with leaving my king in the middle, at least for a few more moves. Uh, and I struck right in the middle with the move c4. The idea behind this move is black's knight is already greatly hampered by my bishop as well as my pawn on the a file. And I just wanted to push black's pieces backwards as far as they can go. You know, kind of clutter up his. If he goes to b6, now all of a sudden this knight is removed from another square to jump to. And it opens us some more space. Maybe we can get the move c5 in at some point to just lock down black's own c pawn. Black ends up going back to e7. And at this point, I played bishop e2. I did take a lot of time, I would say, in this position to think. I wanted to see if moves such as g4 worked, which it looks like it does. It wants rook g1 in order to, I believe, help with push with g4 and other sort of ideas. We have to be obviously careful. If our pawns start falling away from the middle here, then black is going to be easily getting their rooks to the middle of the board, and black's pawns are more reserved, so they're more easily defended if all of a sudden some pieces start coming off the board or if our structure starts to fall apart. Here I play the move bishop to e2, leaving me the option to castle short as well as castle long. And I thought the critical move in this position was knight to f5. I had done a lot of thinking, you know, knight to f5, possibly giving black the idea of jumping into d4, which would have made it a little bit awkward for some of where my light squared bishop wants to go. Maybe it wants to go on this diagonal. You know, this diagonal also looks interesting, even though black does have the move h5. So I thought just having different jumping in points into my position was black's best play. Even starting with h5 themselves, taking away another square from my light square bishop, making it a little bit more difficult for black to unwind. And knight c5. This was also another move. It unleashes black's rook, gets his knight into a further centralized position on the board, it has more pressure on my own position. You know, f5 into d4 or c5 into e4, possibly undermining my dark squared support for some of these pawns in my position. If this starts to collapse, then my game is going to be over. Black ends up going with the move c5, which I personally was really happy to see. Black's thoughts, we talked a little bit after the game. He ends up going for this knight maneuvers from c6 into d4, and this pawn anchors that knight into d4, but I thought his knight coming to c5 was way more dynamic and would have been a lot quicker for him to attack my kind of fragile position as a whole. As you can see, at most I've been a pawn up advantage-wise, which technically I am material-wise. I'm a pawn up. But we've been hovering between that 0s to +1 advantage for the white. So fairly even game in the middle. I play the move bishop to c3, preparing for some sort of jump-ins here with the knights. I also don't want some sort of idea of knight to b6, and then allowing black's rook to get here and start undermine some of my 4th rank pawns. So just another way of taking out some of black's control on the d4 square. Black very naturally brings their other rook over to the center. And at this point, I ended up castling short. I felt that this rook either does a nice job of defending the f4 pawn. My kings are a little bit safer over here on g1. As you can see, our king starts playing a huge role in the defense of some of our pawns and eventually winning the game. But it also just connects my rooks. It felt like it could have been a bad move at the time. Black continues with knight to c6. I bring my rook over to the d file. I wasn't sure where this rook on the a file wanted to be just yet. Obviously, I could have done maybe the same idea as black, putting my rooks on the d file and the e file. But it felt like my files to play on were this open D file and then this half open B file. So I was thinking this A file rook was going to be coming over to the B file. Black plays the move knight to B6, and again I just felt like black was going off the beaten path here. And at this point, we bring our king into the action. We play king to F2. Black jumps into D4. And we end up taking here on D4 with the idea is if fate takes, all of a sudden we're able to get this bishop into a wonderful diagonal. Now we're going to have huge problems for black on that B file. Our king can come up the board to probably D3, blockading this pawn. And we're just going to have probably the ability to take this pawn. I mean, we also have the option of bringing our king to like E4, bringing our rook over to the D file and contesting black for this pawn. If we can get a second pawn up, then we should be able to convert this game. That is not what happened though, as black ends up taking with their pawn, and we end up pushing C5, opening up the eyes of our light squared bishop to the king, the black's king, a little bit more, and putting the question of where black wants to go with his knight yet again. These knights have been going everywhere but forward in black's game so far. Obviously not to C4. Our bishop holds that. I thought possibly knight to D5, putting pressure here on F4. And if here, we're able to get our rook here into the middle, double up on the D file, and again go into the endgame up 2 pawns, probably if we get a rook trade or something of that nature. That's not what happened though, and then obviously the other move is bishop to D7, which is, according to the engine, the top move to play in this position. Black ends up going for this knight to A4 line, thinking that they can jump themselves into C3, putting some pressure on both our bishop and our rook, keeping this pawn on D4 guarded by their rooks. And from here, though, we have a nice little combination, which pretty much secured the game. Bishop to B5, and black is pretty much forced to, at this point, play knight to C3. We, of course, have to go for this trade. You got to calculate this all beforehand. We take the rook. They take our knight with check. It's important to know that it comes with check. After our rook takes, black ends up taking on E8, removing the defender from this D pawn, and pretty much in essence winning us the game. The pawn structure now looks incredible for us, as we have 4 pawns on 3 on the king side, and 3 pawns on 2 on black's queen side. And our rook is dominating the only open file in this game. Our king is way closer to the center of the board than black's king is. And our goal is pretty much to use these pawns to stall black's queen side and to create a pass pawn here on the king side and have our king either infiltrate to attack these pawns or cause a scenario where black gets overextended, either trying to defend their king or queenside pawns. Black brings their rook back to the D file. Makes sense, trying to contest us here. But now, instead of taking right away, which I believe is fine, we can probably take, and you can take, I ended up playing the move rook to D6, kind of solidifying the win at this point. Cuts off any black king advances beyond the 6th rank, unless black wants to trade rooks here. And black's rook really has no good key squares to attack, so he's pretty much out of moves at this point in the game. Black plays the move rook to D7. We just ignore that move. We bring our king closer and closer to black's side of the board. At this point, black traded, and at this point, the game's pretty much won. We have a completely free pass pawn, that black's king is always going to have to babysit. You can never pretty much leave the 6th rank without us queening our d6 pawn. It is heavily guarded by our pawn chain, and we have the ability to get our king towards the middle. At this point, I thought black was maybe going to play the move like king here. But again, we're just going to play probably king over and create a pass pawn. Black ends up pushing the b6 pawn. We solidify our king in the middle, completely securing this d6 pawn. And now there's really no other option for black. They play h6, we play g4, and now it's just a chain reaction. The nice thing is that these two pawns on the a file, which technically people would think would be weak, black can never create a pass pawn here on the queen side, as once a pawn gets here to b4, we just take, and even if their pawn is on a5 and they take back, this pawn is here to defend on a2. So after this move g4, black did resign, just to see kind of how it would go if we continued on further. Let's say he tries to push h5. Well, we can just push f4, and if let's say they take here, well, we can just play check. We could probably just take first, just to be safe. But yeah, you could even play e6. So, but if you wanted to, you could just calmly and collectively push your pawns, and we're gonna have connected pass pawns against black's king, and we're gonna be able to deliver checkmate. That's how the game went in game 5, round 5, I should say, my 4th game of the tournament. I was happy with how I played the game. I used my king effectively in the middle game to sort of get towards the middle, guard key squares. Gave myself opportunities to keep the game dynamic as we had the 2 bishops versus the 2 knights. Wasn't afraid of wacky pawn structures once the queens were off the board. And as you can see from the tail of the tape here at the bottom, fairly even middle game. And then we skyrocketed once we got our advantage there in the middle game. So a great opponent. I appreciate playing against him. He was the my second opponent that I had the chance to afterwards, where we had a nice conversation about the game. Kind of went over some of his ideas. He explained to me, I don't remember it now, but kind of the idea of this move of c6, and pretty much how I thought about it in my head. It's just rapid development for black and puts a lot of pressure on white to counteract that without making a misstep. So this set us up for an interesting game 6/round 6. That video will be next. At this point in the tournament, we were sitting at, we had 3 wins in a row, so we were sitting at 3.5 out of 5. We had that half point bye in round 3, and we had lost our first game. That game would have been nice to win. And we'll be going into game 6 in our next video, where we had white versus the Carl Khan. So I appreciate everyone that made it to the end of the video. Hopefully you learned something from this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. Super interesting game, playing without heavy pieces on the board, and kind of how to use the bishops to corral knights versus knights, and how to push our pawns effectively to create advantages in the middle game. Have a great day, guys.